But I remember anger, and I was so furious about it.
A handwritten letter from Princess Charlotte to Queen Camilla has just exploded online, and the palace is scrambling. Sources claim the note was never meant to be seen, yet its tone, wording, and timing have raised serious eyebrows. Was it innocent childhood honesty, or a message that crossed royal lines? Stay tuned, because the details will leave you stunned. The letter that was never meant to be found. Princess Charlotte sat at the small writing desk in her room with the door closed and the curtains half drawn. The palace was quiet in that particular way it got during the late afternoon, when everyone seemed occupied elsewhere and the long hallways felt empty even when they were not. She had a fountain pen in her hand, the kind her father had given her for her last birthday, and a piece of cream-colored stationery laid out before her. She was not writing for anyone to read. She was writing because the thoughts had become too heavy to carry around inside her chest anymore, and she needed to put them somewhere that was not her own mind. The letter began simply. It was addressed to Camilla, though Charlotte had hesitated over whether to write Grandma or something more formal. She settled on neither and left it as just a name. The words that followed were careful and measured in the way a child writes when they are trying very hard to be fair. Charlotte did not accuse anyone of cruelty or neglect. She did not use dramatic language or make sweeping claims. Instead, she asked questions. She asked why certain people received warmth and attention while others received polite smiles that never quite reached the eyes. She asked why kindness seemed to follow invisible rules inside the palace, rules that shifted depending on who was in the room. She asked why it felt like love was something that could be turned on and off, like a light switch, depending on convenience or appearance. Charlotte wrote about small moments that had built up over time. A birthday where the greeting felt rehearsed. A family gathering where she noticed how the conversation changed when certain people entered or left. The way affection seemed to be performed for cameras and withdrawn in private. She did not write with anger. She wrote with the kind of honesty that children possess before they learn to hide things for the sake of keeping peace. It was not a letter meant to wound. It was a letter meant to understand. Toward the end, she mentioned someone else. She did not name this person directly, but the reference was clear enough. It was someone outside the immediate royal structure, someone who had shown her what unconditional attention looked like, someone who remembered the small details of her life and asked follow-up questions and made her feel like her thoughts mattered even when they were about nothing important. The contrast was not stated outright, but it lingered in the margins of every sentence. Charlotte was not trying to compare. She was simply noticing. When she finished writing, she read the letter over once. Then she folded it carefully and placed it inside a leather-bound notebook she kept in the bottom drawer of her desk. The notebook held other private things. Sketches and half-finished poems and observations about the world that she was not ready to share. She did not plan to send the letter. She did not even plan to read it again. Writing it had been enough. It had given her a way to name what she was feeling, and that was all she needed. The notebook stayed in the drawer for 3 weeks. Then the palace underwent one of its routine staff reshuffles. New housekeeping assignments were distributed. Rooms were deep cleaned and reorganized. A young member of the staff, new to the role and unfamiliar with the unspoken boundaries of royal privacy, was tasked with tidying Charlotte's study area. The notebook was found during a sweep of the desk drawers. It was assumed to be schoolwork or something similarly innocuous. It was set aside with other items to be reviewed and returned. A senior aide came across it later that afternoon while sorting through the collected materials. The aide opened the notebook out of habit, scanning to see if it needed to be filed or returned immediately. The first paragraph of the letter caught their eye. They read it once and then read it again more slowly. The color drained from their face. They closed the notebook and stood very still for a moment, as though trying to decide what to do. Then they left the room and walked quickly toward the private offices reserved for senior household staff. Within 2 hours, there were people in closed rooms speaking in low voices. Calendars were checked and rearranged. A meeting was scheduled for late that evening when fewer people would be moving through the corridors. The notebook was placed in a locked drawer. No one spoke about it openly, but everyone involved understood that something had shifted. The letter was not a scandal in the traditional sense. There were no accusations that could be denied or facts that could be disputed. It was worse than that. It was a child's unfiltered perception, and it could not be argued away. Camilla was informed before the meeting. She was given the letter to read in private. She sat alone in her sitting room with the notebook open in her lap and read every word without interruption. Her expression did not change, but her hands tightened slightly on the edges of the paper. When she finished, she set the notebook down on the table beside her and stared at the wall for a long time. What disturbed her was not that Charlotte had written the letter. Children often felt things they could not fully articulate, and sometimes they got things wrong. What disturbed her was how clearly Charlotte had articulated it. There was no confusion in the writing, no misunderstanding, just observation. And woven quietly through every line was the shadow of someone else, someone Charlotte had held up as a mirror without ever needing to say the name aloud. Camilla closed the notebook and locked it in her desk. Then she made a phone call that would set the next 48 hours into motion. Because if there was one thing she understood about legacy, it was this. History did not care about explanations. It cared about what was remembered, and children had a way of remembering everything. The villain's fear. Camilla did not sleep well that night. She lay awake in the dark and thought about all the careful work she had done over the years to reshape her image and soften the edges of a story that had never been hers to control from the beginning. She had endured the headlines and the scrutiny and the endless comparisons. She had waited and smiled and played the part she was given until the public slowly and grudgingly began to accept her. And now a child had written a letter that could undo all of it, not with scandal but with something far more dangerous: clarity. The meeting the next morning was held in a windowless room on the second floor where conversations could not be overheard. Camilla arrived first and sat at the head of the table with the notebook in front of her. The senior aides filed in quietly and took their seats. No one spoke until the door was closed. Camilla opened the notebook and placed it in the center of the table where everyone could see it, though no one reached for it. She explained the situation calmly. The letter was private and never intended for anyone's eyes. It was the emotional working through of a young girl trying to make sense of relationships she did not fully understand. It was not malicious, but it was also not something that could be allowed to exist. Not in writing, not where it could be found again or photographed or passed along. The palace had survived scandals before, but this was not a scandal. This was a record, and records had a way of surfacing at the worst possible moments. One of the aides, an older woman who had served the family for decades, hesitated before speaking. She suggested that destroying a child's personal writing crossed a line that might create more problems than it solved. If it were ever discovered that something like this had been confiscated and destroyed, there would be questions about what else had been silenced. Camilla listened without interrupting and then reminded everyone present exactly who held authority in this household and what that authority allowed her to do. The letter would be destroyed. There would be no copies made, no photographs taken, no record kept in any file or archive. It would be as though it had never existed. The aide who had found it would be reassigned quietly and without explanation. The staff member who had misplaced it would be reminded of the protocols around personal belongings, and no one in that room would speak of this again. The meeting ended and the aides left one by one. Camilla remained seated with the notebook still open in front of her. She had won this round, but she did not feel victorious. She felt tired. She knew that destroying the letter would not erase what Charlotte had written. It would not change what the child had observed or felt, but it would remove the evidence. And in a world built on perception and image, evidence was everything. Catherine was informed later that same day. The message came through private channels, quietly, and without ceremony. She was told that a personal item belonging to Charlotte had been found and reviewed and that certain decisions had been made regarding its contents. She was given a copy of the letter before the original was destroyed. The aide who delivered it watched her face carefully, but Catherine gave nothing away. She read the letter in silence. She did not ask questions. She did not object to the decision. She simply thanked the aide and closed the door. Alone in her room, Catherine read the letter again. She recognized her daughter's handwriting and the particular way Charlotte phrased things when she was trying to be fair, even when fairness hurt. She saw the honesty in every line and the quiet comparison that had clearly unsettled Camilla more than any accusation ever could. Catherine understood what the letter was. It was emotional evidence. It was her daughter trying to name something she did not yet have the language to fully explain. Catherine folded the letter carefully and placed it in a locked drawer in her private desk. She would not destroy it. She would not show it to anyone. But she would not let it disappear either. Because whatever else happened in the years to come, she wanted Charlotte to know that her honesty had been heard, that her feelings mattered, that she would not be punished for seeing clearly. Catherine stood by the window and looked out at the gardens where Charlotte often played in the afternoons. She thought about legacy and history and the way children remembered things that adults tried to bury. She thought about the invisible rules of kindness inside the palace and the way some people learned to perform affection while others simply gave it. And she made a quiet decision that would shape everything that came after. Charlotte would not be scolded. She would not be told that what she had written was wrong or unfair. She would not be made to feel ashamed of her own perceptions. Instead, Catherine would watch and wait and protect her daughter's right to feel what she felt. Because the real danger was not in a child writing an honest letter. The real danger was in teaching that child that honesty was something to be feared. And Catherine would not let that lesson take root. But across the palace, in another room entirely, Camilla sat with a fireplace poker in her hand and fed the pages of Charlotte's letter into the flames one by one. She watched the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash. She told herself it was necessary. She told herself it was protective. She told herself it changed nothing. And yet, as the last page dissolved into smoke, she could not shake the feeling that somewhere in this palace, a 10-year-old girl was learning exactly what kind of woman her step-grandmother really was. And that lesson, unlike the letter, could never be burned away. Rewriting the child. Camilla did not announce her intentions. She simply began reshaping Charlotte's schedule with the kind of quiet authority that made objections seem inappropriate before they were even raised. Within a week of the letter's destruction, new appointments appeared on Charlotte's calendar. Additional etiquette sessions, private tutorials on royal protocol, afternoon meetings with a behavioral consultant who specialized in preparing young royals for public life. The sessions were presented as opportunities for growth and refinement. No one used words like correction or intervention, but everyone understood what was happening. Charlotte attended the first session without complaint. She sat in a high-backed chair in a room she had never been in before and listened to a woman with perfect posture explain the importance of measured responses and appropriate emotional expression. The woman spoke about representing the family with grace, about understanding that personal feelings were less important than public perception, about learning to separate the child from the princess. Charlotte nodded at all the right moments. She answered questions politely. She did not argue or push back, but something behind her eyes had changed. The sessions continued twice a week. Charlotte learned which topics were safe for conversation and which were best avoided. She learned how to deflect personal questions with charm. She learned the particular smile that conveyed warmth without promising intimacy. She learned that vulnerability was a liability, and that honesty could be reframed as naivety if it inconvenienced the wrong people. She absorbed every lesson without visible resistance, and with each passing week she spoke a little less at family dinners and observed a little more carefully during public events. Catherine noticed the change first. Charlotte had always been thoughtful, but now there was a guardedness to her daughter that had not existed before. She asked careful questions and received carefully constructed answers. When Catherine tried to reach past the politeness, Charlotte did not refuse her exactly. She simply redirected. It was a skill she had clearly learned during those etiquette sessions, and it broke Catherine's heart to see it used on her. William was briefed on the situation 3 weeks after the letter had been found. He had been traveling for official engagements, and the palace had deemed it unnecessary to interrupt his schedule for what they called a minor internal matter. When he finally sat down with the senior aides and heard the full story, his jaw tightened in a way that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. He asked to see the letter. He was told it had been destroyed per Camilla's orders. He asked why he had not been informed immediately. The silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. William requested a private meeting with Camilla. It was held in her sitting room over tea that neither of them touched. She explained that she had acted in Charlotte's best interest, that children often wrote things they did not fully mean when they were upset, that it was important to guide Charlotte toward a more measured understanding of family dynamics before her perceptions became fixed. William listened without interrupting. Then he asked if Camilla understood that what she was describing was not guidance, it was erasure. Camilla reminded him that she had decades of experience navigating the complexities of royal life, and that sometimes difficult decisions had to be made for the protection of everyone involved. William reminded her that Charlotte was his daughter and that any decisions about her upbringing required his consent. The conversation ended without resolution, but William left with a clarity he had not possessed before. He recognized the patterns, the pressure disguised as preparation, the way emotional honesty was reframed as immaturity. He had lived through this himself as a child, and he had promised himself his own children would not. The advisors approached William carefully over the following days. They suggested that taking a public stance against Camilla's handling of the situation would create unnecessary conflict within the family, that Charlotte was resilient and would adapt, that sometimes maintaining unity required small compromises. William listened to all of it and then made a decision that none of them had anticipated. He asked Catherine for her copy of the letter. She gave it to him without hesitation. He took it to a secure location and made a second copy. Then he locked it away where no one could reach it without his explicit permission. He did not tell Camilla. He did not inform the advisors. He simply ensured that the letter could not be disappeared a second time, because he understood something the palace strategists did not. This was not about a single piece of paper. This was about whether his daughter's voice mattered, whether her perceptions were valid, whether she would grow up learning that truth could be destroyed if it was inconvenient. And William had already watched too many people sacrifice honesty for the sake of appearances. He would not let Charlotte become one of them. Charlotte continued attending her etiquette sessions. She continued smiling at the appropriate moments and saying the expected things. But in the privacy of her room, she started a new notebook. This one she kept better hidden, and in it she wrote not letters but observations. Small details about who said what and when, who changed their tone depending on the audience, who performed kindness and who simply gave it. She was learning exactly what the palace wanted to teach her, just not in the way they intended. Because Charlotte was not being rewritten, she was learning to read between the lines, and that was a far more dangerous skill than anyone realized. Somewhere in the palace machinery, a 10-year-old girl was becoming fluent in the language of power, and the people trying to silence her had just given her every reason to pay attention. The second copy. The palace moved forward as though the matter had been resolved. Camilla received reports that Charlotte's etiquette sessions were progressing well. The behavioral consultant noted that the princess had become remarkably composed and cooperative. The staff who had been involved in the incident were reassigned without fanfare. The notebook had been destroyed. The letter no longer existed in any official capacity. As far as the palace was concerned, the problem had been handled with discretion and efficiency. Camilla allowed herself to believe that the worst had passed. She did not know about the copies. She did not know that Catherine had read the letter so many times she could recite it from memory. She did not know that William had locked a second copy in a safe that only he could access. She did not know that the very thing she had tried to erase had been preserved in multiple forms by the two people who had the most reason to protect Charlotte's voice. Camilla had declared victory, but the war had simply moved underground. The truth emerged during a private dinner that was meant to be a gesture of reconciliation. Camilla had suggested it herself. A quiet family meal with no staff present and no formal agenda. Just William and Catherine and the children gathering for an evening that might ease some of the tension that had been building since the incident. Catherine accepted the invitation with polite gratitude. William agreed without enthusiasm. Charlotte was told she would be expected to attend, and she nodded with the same carefully blank expression she had perfected over the past month. The dinner began cordially enough. Camilla made pleasant conversation about upcoming events and asked the children about their studies. Charlotte answered every question with flawless politeness. She said exactly what was expected and nothing more. Her responses were so perfectly calibrated that they revealed absolutely nothing about what she was actually thinking. Camilla smiled and praised her progress, but there was something unsettling about the exchange. It felt like talking to a small diplomat rather than a child. Halfway through the meal, Camilla made a comment about how lovely it was that the recent difficulties had been resolved and that everyone could move forward without lingering unpleasantness. Catherine set down her fork very carefully. She looked directly at Camilla and said that nothing had been resolved, that destroying a letter did not erase what it contained, that Charlotte's feelings had not changed simply because the evidence of them had been burned. Camilla stiffened and suggested that it was inappropriate to discuss such matters in front of the children. Catherine continued as though Camilla had not spoken. She said that she had read the letter so many times she could recite it word for word if necessary, that every question Charlotte had asked was burned into her memory, that no amount of etiquette training would change the fact that her daughter had observed something true and painful and had been punished for it. The table went very quiet. William reached over and placed his hand on Catherine's wrist, not to stop her, but to let her know he was with her. Then William spoke. He said that he also had the letter, that he had made a copy before the original could be destroyed a second time, that it was locked away somewhere safe, that Camilla's attempt to erase Charlotte's words had failed because the people who loved Charlotte most had refused to let it succeed. Camilla's face went pale. She asked how he could possibly have a copy when the letter had been destroyed immediately. Catherine explained that she had been given a copy before the destruction, that she had shared it with William because they made decisions about their children together, always. Camilla looked between them with something close to shock. She had believed the situation was contained. She had been assured that the letter no longer existed. And now she was being told that 2 copies remained in the hands of people she could not control. She stood abruptly and said that they had betrayed her trust, that she had acted to protect Charlotte and the family, and this was how they repaid her. William remained seated. He said that protecting Charlotte meant listening to her, not silencing her, that if Camilla truly could not see the difference, then perhaps that was the real problem. The dinner ended without dessert. Camilla left the room and did not return. The children were dismissed quietly. Charlotte walked past her grandmother's empty chair without looking at it. She had not said a single word during the confrontation. She had simply watched and listened and absorbed everything. Later that night, Catherine found her sitting by the window in her room, staring out at the dark gardens. Catherine asked if she was all right. Charlotte said she was fine. Her voice was calm and detached, and it frightened Catherine more than tears would have. 2 weeks later, there was a formal family gathering, a christening for a distant cousin, the kind of event that required attendance from senior royals and provided ample opportunities for photographs and public displays of unity. Charlotte was expected to be there. She wore a pale blue dress and had her hair pinned back with the same careful precision she brought to everything now. She stood beside her parents during the ceremony. She smiled when photographers pointed cameras in her direction. She spoke when spoken to and said all the correct things. But she volunteered nothing. She initiated no conversations. She expressed no opinions that had not been directly solicited. When Camilla approached her after the ceremony and asked how she was enjoying the day, Charlotte looked at her with clear, unwavering eyes and said it was lovely. Just that, nothing more. No elaboration, no warmth. Just perfect, empty politeness. Camilla tried to continue the conversation, but Charlotte had already turned away to rejoin her parents. The dismissal was so subtle that no one watching would have noticed it, but Camilla felt it like a door closing. She stood in the middle of the reception hall, surrounded by family and well-wishers, and realized with creeping discomfort that she had not won anything. The letter still existed. Charlotte's perceptions had not changed. And worse than any of that, the child had learned to hide. Camilla had wanted to guide Charlotte toward appropriate behavior. Instead, she had taught her granddaughter to perform, to conceal, to watch and wait and reveal nothing. Charlotte was no longer writing letters. She was simply storing observations, and her silence was far more unsettling than her honesty had ever been. Because a child who speaks can be corrected. A child who writes can be silenced. But a child who watches and remembers and says nothing at all is something else entirely. And as Camilla watched Charlotte move through the gathering with flawless, distant politeness, she understood for the first time that she had not rewritten the child. She had simply taught her to stop trusting anyone inside the palace walls. And that lesson, once learned, could never be unlearned. The fatal mistake. Camilla waited 3 days after the christening before she made her move. She had spent those days watching Charlotte from a distance and trying to understand what had gone wrong. The child was behaving perfectly, too perfectly, and that perfection felt like a wall Camilla could not breach. She decided that what was needed was a direct conversation. She found Charlotte in the library on a Thursday afternoon. The child was reading alone in one of the window seats with her legs tucked beneath her and a book open in her lap. Camilla entered quietly and closed the door behind her. Charlotte looked up but did not move. Camilla sat down in the chair across from her and said they needed to talk. Charlotte marked her page and set the book aside. She folded her hands in her lap and waited with the same neutral expression she had worn at the christening. Camilla began by saying that she understood Charlotte might have felt hurt by recent events, that sometimes adults had to make choices that children did not fully understand, that protecting the family sometimes meant protecting them from themselves. Charlotte listened without interrupting. Camilla continued. She said that honesty was important, but so was discretion. That words written in private could cause damage if they fell into the wrong hands. That the crown had endured for centuries because people had learned when to speak and when to remain silent. That Charlotte was old enough now to understand that her feelings, while valid, could not always take priority over the institution. She spoke about duty and sacrifice, about how everyone in the family had to give up pieces of themselves for the greater good, about how Charlotte's letter, while heartfelt, could have been used to hurt people Camilla cared about. She implied, without stating directly, that Charlotte's honesty had been a kind of betrayal. That by writing down her observations, Charlotte had created a weapon that could be turned against the family. She said all of this gently. She used soft tones and careful words. She thought she was being kind. Charlotte sat very still through all of it. When Camilla finally stopped talking, there was a long silence. Then Charlotte spoke. Her voice was quiet but perfectly clear. She said that she had thought the crown was meant to protect people like her, not the other way around. Then she picked up her book and returned to reading as though the conversation had ended. Camilla felt the words land like a slap. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out, because Charlotte had not argued with her, had not defended herself or pushed back. She had simply stated a fact that undermined everything Camilla had just said. The child had exposed the fundamental flaw in the entire justification with a single sentence, and there was no answer Camilla could give that would not prove Charlotte's point. Camilla left the library without another word. Charlotte did not look up from her book, but her hands were shaking slightly as she turned the page. She had not planned what she said, it had simply come out. And now she understood that she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She had questioned the very foundation of the system she was supposed to serve, and she had done it directly to the woman who embodied that system's priorities. Catherine learned about the confrontation within 2 hours. One of the housekeeping staff had been passing by the library and heard voices through the door. They had not eavesdropped intentionally, but they had heard enough to know that Camilla had cornered Charlotte alone. The staff member reported it to Catherine's private secretary, who brought it immediately to Catherine's attention. Catherine thanked them calmly and then went to find her daughter. Charlotte was still in the library. Catherine sat down beside her and asked what had happened. Charlotte repeated the conversation almost word for word. She had a remarkable memory for dialogue, and she recounted Camilla's points with careful accuracy. When she got to her own response, she looked at Catherine with something like fear in her eyes. She asked if she had said something wrong. Catherine pulled her daughter close and told her she had said exactly the right thing, that she should never apologize for speaking the truth, that the crown existed to protect its people, and if it had forgotten that, then it needed to be reminded. But Catherine also understood that Charlotte was no longer safe from private confrontations. Camilla had overstepped, and there was no guarantee she would not do it again. Catherine made a series of quiet decisions over the next 48 hours. She restructured Charlotte's daily schedule. The behavioral consultant was dismissed with a polite but firm explanation that her services were no longer needed. The etiquette sessions were reduced to once a month and moved to times when Catherine could be present. Charlotte's access to staff was limited to people Catherine trusted completely, people who had been with the family for years and who understood that their loyalty was to the children, not to palace politics. Educational schedules were adjusted. Charlotte would spend more time studying at home with private tutors Catherine personally vetted, less time in palace-controlled environments where she could be isolated or approached without supervision. The changes were presented as routine adjustments to accommodate Charlotte's growing academic needs. No one questioned them publicly, but everyone understood what was actually happening. Catherine was drawing a perimeter around her daughter, and Camilla was being kept on the outside of it. Camilla had meant to guide the child. Instead, she had taught her to guard herself, and in doing so, she had lost whatever fragile connection they might have built. The fatal mistake was not confronting Charlotte. It was believing that a 10-year-old could be manipulated into forgetting what she knew. Charlotte had not forgotten. She had simply stopped sharing. And in a family built on image and perception, silence was the most devastating response of all. The truth that stayed. Charlotte began writing again 6 weeks after the library confrontation. She did not write letters this time. She wrote observations in a small journal Catherine had given her. The journal had a lock, and Catherine kept the only key. Charlotte wrote about what she noticed during family gatherings, about who spoke and who stayed silent, about which conversations felt genuine and which felt performed. She wrote about the staff members who smiled at her with real warmth and the ones who smiled because it was their job. She was not trying to build a case against anyone. She was simply teaching herself to see clearly. The letter she had written to Camilla still existed in Catherine's locked drawer and in William's safe. But Charlotte wanted to write something different now, something that was not addressed to anyone else. She sat down one evening and rewrote the letter to herself. She kept the same observations but changed the tone. This version was not asking questions, it was answering them. She wrote about what she had learned, about how kindness could be performed, about how power protected itself, about how the people who claimed to act in her best interest often meant their own. She wrote it all down with the same careful honesty she had used before. Then she gave it to Catherine. Catherine read it alone in her room. She cried for the first time since the whole situation had begun, not because the letter was cruel, but because it was clear-sighted in a way that no child should have to be. Charlotte had learned to see through the performance. She had learned to distinguish between love and obligation, and she had learned it because the people who should have protected her innocence had instead taught her to doubt. Catherine locked the new letter away with the old one. She did not show it to William. She did not discuss it with anyone. She simply kept it safe because someday Charlotte might want to remember what she had understood at 10 years old. Camilla began to sense the shift in how people responded to her. It was nothing she could point to directly. People still addressed her with appropriate deference. They still followed her instructions and attended to her requests. But something had changed in the quality of their attention. Conversations that used to flow naturally now felt stilted. Rooms that used to quiet respectfully when she entered now felt cold. Her presence no longer commanded the space the way it once had. She was still obeyed, but she was no longer quite trusted. The real change happened in private meetings where palace strategy was discussed. Camilla had always been included in these conversations. Her perspective had been valued particularly on matters of public image and media management. But after the incident with Charlotte, she noticed that certain topics were discussed without her. William called a meeting with the senior household staff 3 months after the letter had first been found. He did not raise his voice. He did not make threats. He simply stated clearly that his children were off limits for any form of character shaping or private intervention that did not have explicit parental approval. The message was received exactly as intended. The staff members who had enabled Camilla's private confrontation with Charlotte understood that they had backed the wrong authority. The ones who had reported the confrontation to Catherine understood that their loyalty had been noted and appreciated. William did not mention Camilla by name. He did not have to. Everyone in the room knew exactly what had prompted the statement, and everyone understood that the rules had changed. Camilla heard about the meeting secondhand. She was not present when William made his statement. That absence was itself a message. She had been excluded from a meeting about household protocol involving the children. Her role as step-grandmother had been quietly but firmly circumscribed. She could attend family functions. She could appear in photographs. But she could not shape how the children were raised or intervene in their emotional development. That authority belonged to William and Catherine alone, and it would not be shared. She considered confronting William directly, asking him why she had been excluded, defending her actions with Charlotte as well-intentioned. But she knew that conversation would not go the way she wanted. William had made his position clear through the structure of the meeting itself. Confronting him would only force him to state explicitly what he had already communicated through action. And Camilla did not want those words said aloud where they could not be taken back. So she remained silent and accepted the new boundaries and told herself it was temporary. But it was not temporary. The restrictions stayed in place. Charlotte's schedule remained controlled by Catherine. William's directive about staff access remained enforced, and slowly Camilla's influence over the daily lives of William's children shrank to almost nothing. Charlotte grew more confident as the months passed, not in a loud or showy way, but in the quiet certainty that she was being protected, that her parents had heard her and believed her and restructured her entire world to keep her safe.